My name is Deborah Bonello. I'm the managing editor here at InsightCrime.org, and I'm joined by Steven Dudley, the co-director of Insight Crime. Steve, we've been watching the news this morning, and the latest news from the Trump administration that the president has secretly signed a directive to the Pentagon to begin using military force against some of Latin America's drug cartels that his administration has deemed terrorist organizations. What was your reaction when you first heard this news, Steve?
I think this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what these organizations are. I thought about all the work that we've done on the ground in places like Mexico, where presumably a lot of these targets are. And what we have found over and over and over again is that these are extremely dispersed networks. These are not top down, centrally organized or structured groups that have clear lines of command. Instead, there are cells that are spread about doing lots of different activities, some of them enforcing violence, some of them are fighting security forces, some of them are selling drugs on the streets, some of them are working to pass drugs over to the United States. But it's not like a centrally organized operation, and they have no political agenda. So this isn't like an insurgency. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of who these criminal groups are. So who are you actually going to target? That's the big question.
That is a massive question. And do you have any sort of idea of how this could play out?
We don't, in part because the US administration and Trump in particular is so unpredictable in many respects and has used and combined the sort of leverage that the United States has from an economic perspective with this counter crime, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism strategy. So we don't know how those two things are going to overlap or combine. They seem to be running on parallel tracks right now. And as it relates to Mexico, that has meant reprieves on the economic front that no other country has had. So the presumption is that we're not looking down the barrel of an immediate or imminent invasion by the United States in Mexico, just because of what we're looking at from the economic sanctions perspective. However, this administration is incredibly unpredictable. So we just don't know what happens next.
We don't, and I think we can both agree. We've seen sort of very measured leadership from the Mexican side, and President Claudia Sheinbaum, I think, has had a moment to shine since Trump has come in and taken power. And she's been open about allowing the flying of U.S. drones over into Mexican territory, but
Yeah.
this is way more intense in terms of what Trump seems to be proposing, and it is, from where I'm sitting, a threat to Mexico's sovereignty. Like, do you think this could start a war between Mexico and the United States?
I think a war is a strong word when it comes to Mexico and the United States. I think there could be incidents that would upend um, any sort of bilateral arrangement or relationship. But full scale war, I think, yeah, I don't think we're there just yet. But again, this is a very unpredictable administration. They seem, on the surface anyway, more interested in the political showmanship than the actual results or even the reality on the ground, as we've already talked about. So it's hard to know where that political showmanship needs to go in order for them to achieve their objectives, which are to illustrate that they are ready to fight this fight as a war. And it is just not a conventional war. So if they actually go and that reality um, sort of smacks them in the face that this isn't what they think it is, then that could be a problem. So I think there are enough smart people to know that that is probably not a good idea. It's probably best to keep it in the show area rather than the tell.
Yeah, and it's hard to sort of picture, if you and I see this unprecedented sight of US military rolling over the US Mexico border. I mean, where are they going to go? Who are they going to attack? Or, are we talking about kids who look out for drug cartels on the streets, or young men and women who sell drugs from sales points? Or are we talking about parts of the cartel that control the major drug smuggling routes to the US? And without good intelligence, how are they even going to know where to go? I mean, these are sort of my first reactions to this.
Yeah, and they probably have pretty good intelligence, and that good intelligence is going to tell them exactly what we're saying, which is that these are not top-down structures. These are very dispersed networks. So what are you actually taking out? I mean, maybe at that point we are also looking at what will largely be a show. You'll go after some of the top leaders. Maybe you'll arrest some of them. There might be some high-profile battles. You'll bring them back hogtied on your airplanes to illustrate your resolve, and then that will be it. I would presume that that is what we're talking about this at this stage, because there's nothing else really that you can do in terms of dismantling any of these really dispersed networks that go all the way to your predominantly US citizens that are crossing the border with these small quantities of synthetic drugs like fentanyl. So if you were going to go after the cartels, well, you'd have to be arresting what is, I believe, the last estimates were some 90% of the people who were crossing over the border were US citizens. So that would be one of your main targets, presumably, if you're really going after fentanyl. So that I don't think is going to happen. I think we're going to see much more uh, just sort of targeted efforts at high profile kingpins or the sort of upper leadership, and that will be about it.
Right. And as we've seen historically, we have some major Mexican cartel leaders
Mm.
in the US justice system, a game of chess that's been happening for decades. And that also hasn't really slowed the drug trade. So the idea that they're going to come over and arrest those head honchos themselves is just kind of another version of the same thing. We'll wrap this up, Steve, but to take this a little bit more bird's eye momentarily, how do you see what the saber rattling around Mexico and the rhetoric around Mexico and the Trump administration compares to their approach to President Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, which, as we've done extensive research on, is kind of this hybrid mafia state where drug trafficking is very deeply embedded within the Venezuelan government?
I think there's an important fundamental difference here, and that is that most of the executive orders and orders regarding Venezuela are directed at the Venezuelan government, directly at the Venezuelan government, whether we're talking about their supposed efforts to have members of Tren de Aragua in the United States waging some kind of insurgency or whatever you want to call it in the United States, which is what they did with the Alien Enemies Act executive order, or whether we're talking about them putting a bounty of $50 million on President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela. These are things that are related to state activities, government activities, or state embedded criminal groups. So your target there is much clearer. And it presents us with a parallel to the most important case in which the United States military was used against drug trafficking groups, which was against Manuel Noriega, President Manuel Noriega, then President Manuel Noriega of Panama. And that was a military invasion. Is that where we're headed? Well, we don't know, but certainly that is a closer parallel in the Venezuela case than it is in the case of Mexico.
Yeah.
So these are fundamentally different in a very important way.
Yeah, I agree with you. And at this early stage, it's really hard to know how words coming out of the White House right now and promises coming out of the White House right now are actually going to manifest on the ground.
I would just say one more thing, which is that it's not that we don't think that this is important. There is a lot of violence generated by these organized crime groups. And certainly over the years, US assistance to quell that violence has been and remains super important. That is the fundamental concern in most of these countries is the violence generated by organized crime groups or related to organized crime. And so if the US can push in that direction and other nations as well in a concerted effort, I think that that is the right direction to go. But if we're talking about invading forces that are supposedly going to magically dismantle some of these criminal groups, there's a whole host of dominoes that fall that we can't predict that go way beyond what we can see right now on the chessboard, and that's going to be really, really difficult to control if the United States crosses, as you have termed, these red lines.
Yeah, I agree with you. We're just going to have to wait and see what plays out over the next days and weeks, Steve. And for those of you watching, if you want to learn more about the criminal groups that we're talking about, you can find everything on insightcrime.org, as well as analysis around the decades of drug war in Latin America. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Deb.